I'd like to introduce you tonight to a couple different people. First, I'd like to thank Vern Morris, Dr. Vern Morris, and the rest of the Florida Postal History Society for sponsoring this opportunity. And Vern actually met Jack, and it sounds like they have developed a good working relationship. And anytime I know I go to some shows and do things with Vern, and anytime we find somebody with knowledge, that's good. We can use that person, and we love sharing that, especially if it's about Florida. That's awesome. Did you want to say a few words, Vern?
Yes, I appreciate Jack spending the time, and he was a great inspiration. Excuse me. A year ago, when I began writing my article on Fort Myers, and he's very dedicated, knowledgeable, enthusiastic, and appreciate his spending the evening with us.
That's awesome. And that comes from all of the Florida Postal History Society. Dr. Briggs, Tom Leary, you guys really have another great organization with a lot of great information, great website. And anybody that's interested, we definitely hope that you come and take a look at the website. And you just do a search, Florida Postal History Society. You'll find it very easily. So Jack is with us tonight, and just a little bit about his background. He's an Air Force veteran, a medical technologist, worked in state police forensic laboratories. Sounds like a CSI guy. I don't know if they did that about you. I don't know. A lot of crime scene investigation. But now we know he's worked all those years for the most important thing. He volunteers at the Imaginarium Museum in the history section, and he's in Fort Myers area, and gives presentations on Fort Myers history. So that's really awesome for us, and we really appreciate that. And Jack tonight's going to discuss forts along the, and I know you put this in there to see how if I was going to pronounce it, Caloosahatchee. I'm from Philadelphia. I apologize to all you Florida people, but I'm learning how this stuff. During the Seminole Wars, which Vern sparked an interest in the Seminole Wars for me, it's really been great down here. And Dr. Briggs also, I mean, you guys have been very supportive with that, and it's a really interesting postal history topic. So really looking forward to this. These Jack's going to talk a little about the physical makeup of Fort Myers during both the Seminole and the Civil War, and also a brief overview of the battle at Fort Myers. So we appreciate you being here, Jack. And if you'd like to get started, that'd be great.
Okay, thank you very much, Steve, and thank you, Vernon. I'd like to start way back in the Second Seminole War. This is going to be 1838. Colonel Percival Smith is going to establish 4 outposts along the Caloosahatchee. And the first one will be Fort Thompson, which is just east of current-day LaBelle. And it's right near the headwaters of the Caloosahatchee at Lake Flirt. 2 others will be located just west of current-day LaBelle, and that'd be Fort Adams and Fort Danaut. But the fort that really is important, and what I'm going to be talking about this evening, is the 4th fort, and that is Fort Delaney. And Fort Delaney is located at San Carlos Bay at Punta Rasa. Now, Punta Rasa means point of cows. The important location for Fort Delaney, it was very close to a deep water channel, which would allow ocean-going ships to come in and offload supplies. If anyone has boated around the Gulf of Mexico or any of these inlets, you know you can go aground very quickly if you don't have a GPS or you're not following maps. But this channel was extremely important for the sustainability of Fort Delaney and the forts that would extend all the way up the Caloosahatchee. In October of 1841, a hurricane is going to hit Southwest Florida, and it's going to destroy Fort Delaney. 2 soldiers are going to be killed. A ship that was tied up on the wharf is going to get pushed inland for quite a distance. Now, Captain McCavitt, who is the commander, is going to receive orders to reconnoiter up the Caloosahatchee to try to find a more suitable place for a fort, a place that would be better protected with no chance of storm surge, And he will take a small party and he goes up probably about 15 or so miles upward. And on the south side of the river, he will locate an expanse of high ground. They call it a hammock. It's covered with pine, palm, and oak trees. There will be a creek with sufficient fresh water right nearby. And the other thing that McCavitt will note is there's a breeze that continually comes across the river. And he believes that this is going to help moderate the temperatures as well as keep the mosquitoes down. And at this time in the South, and especially Florida, malaria is endemic and it affects the troops. A lot of troops will come down with malaria. It'll be debilitating to some, and to others it can be fatal. So this is a pretty good description of what he found. He is going to bring up the rest of his troops, and they are going to begin construction of a fort. And he's going to name the fort Fort Harvie after one of his subordinate officers who died from malaria the previous fall. And Fort Harvie is only going to be in existence for about 5 months, because by March of 1842, the Second Seminole War is over and the place will be abandoned. Over time, things will start falling down, but more importantly, the Indians will come by and burn any structures that are remaining. Now we're going to talk about the Third Seminole War, which officially started around 1850 and ended in 1858. The commander of all United States troops in Florida at this time is General David Emanuel Twiggs. And he is going to put out an order on February 14th of 1850 to Captain Ridgely to take 2 companies of artillerymen down along the Caloosahatchee to try to find a suitable place for a fort. And where he finds the best location is where Fort Harvie was previously located. And of course, at this time, there's nothing remaining of Fort Harvie. Now, he will begin the process of establishing the fort. And on February 20th, he'll top off a pine tree, attach a flagstaff, and the United States flag will fly over the site for the first time. And he will name the fort Fort Myers. Well, at this time, it's important to note that forts are normally named after men who are killed in combat, for example, Captain Dade, or men who died during the time of conflict, like Lieutenant Harvie from malaria. Fort Myers, however, is going to be named after Abraham C. Myers. He is a quartermaster officer, not a combat officer. He has been under the command of General Twiggs for several years. But more important to our story, he's engaged to marry Marion Twiggs, the general's daughter. And of course, if you remember, the order was issued on February 14th. Now that's a date the men of listening should not forget about, because that could lead to problems later on. But Myers will never be assigned to his namesake fort, nor will he ever visit it. But prior to the establishment of Fort Myers, during the Second Seminole War, he will be on a patrol with Captain McCavitt, and they will help bring up supplies along the Caloosahatchee on the river to Fort Harvie. So he actually will be at the site of where his namesake fort will be built. To finish off on Myers personally, he is a South Carolinian by birth. After the end of the Seminole Wars, he will be sent up to New Orleans. They'll get married there. And of course, in 1859, John Brown's aborted attempt at a slave uprising will occur. And then in December 1860, South Carolina will secede. And with that, Abraham Myers will resign from the United States Army and join the Confederate States Army. He will rise in the ranks as quartermaster. He will be the chief quartermaster up until 1864, where he fails to get a promotion to general, and he then resigns from Confederate service. At the end of the Civil War, he and Marion will go to Europe, and they will stay in Europe until 1877. Now, the reason he left the United States, speculate on this, but more than likely, there were a number of higher up Confederate government officials, as well as Confederate officers, that feared reparations from the federal government after the war, and they would flee the country. John Breckinridge, Judah Benjamin were two of the important Confederates that did, as well as, of course, Abraham Myers and a flock of others. Now, after at 1877, they are going to return to the United States, live in Maryland for a little bit, and then Washington City, and he will die about 2 or 3 years later. Well, this is an example of where the fort is located in Fort Myers. Here you have a Google map, and the fort was actually located in the downtown area, or I should say, what became the downtown area of Fort Myers. First Street here is considered the main street in Fort Myers today. These brown bars that you see represent the stockade that was the perimeter of the fort. And of course, we have the pier and the wharf. Very important at this time, the fort could only be supplied via the river. There are no roads in Florida. This is 1850 Florida, and there's probably billions of mosquitoes and a lot of reptiles and mammals, fish and shellfish, but there's no roads, just an Indian trail. The Caloosahatchee, up as far as current day Olga, is an estuary. So it's going to have tidal variations. So these ships, even if they were low draft, would have to probably come up with a high tide. So timing is important as well. But generally, I've read a letter from an engineering officer, and what they would do is the low draft ship would bring it as far north along the river as they could, and then offload it onto a barge, and that barge would be towed up by a rowboat up until it got to the pier and then unloaded there. Now, the Seminole Wars, specifically the third one, marked the last phase of the Indian removal along the eastern seaboard. Prior to this time, the major Indian groups have been subdued by force and forcibly relocated into the West. And the West where they went was that time called Arkansas Territory. And that part of the Arkansas Territory where they were located is the current day state of Oklahoma. And that's why if you look on the map of Oklahoma, you will see counties named after Indian tribes, and those are that is the location where those tribes were relocated to. So you have Cherokee County, Osage, Choctaw Creek, and about 40 to 50 miles southeast of Oklahoma City is Seminole County, with the county seat of Muskogee. Muskogee refers to the base language that would evolve into the Creek and the Seminole tongues. They would share a common language. And if any of you are country western fans, you know the song Okie from Muskogee by Merle Haggard, and that is the Muskogee that he was talking about. Now, the prominent chief during the Third Seminole War, who had the most power or influence, would be Billy Bowlegs. He did not have bow legs, and so you don't want to call him that. His Indian name was Holata Miko. He got the nickname Bowlegs more than likely from the Indian name Bolek, which identified a previous Seminole chief. Some people have forwarded the belief that he had a French ancestor somewhere in his family tree by the name of Bouillot. We really don't know, but I think the speculation is best to consider it came from Bolek. Now, at this time, the federal government has spent much money trying to subdue the Indians, and especially at this time, the Seminoles. The environment for military operations in Florida at this time is horrific at best. A lot of the soldiers are sick, not only from malaria, but from a lot of other tropical diseases, and let alone deaths in combat. So the federal government is going to try to stop the expenditure of money and manpower and somehow get the Seminoles to vacate Florida. Initially, they will, before the hostilities get too bad, they will invite and take Billy Bowlegs up to Washington City. He will meet the Great White Father, well, not the Great White Father, but a Great White Father. He probably met someone in the Indian Bureau. But primarily what they wanted to do was to show Billy the magnificence of the white man's civilization. And Billy really wasn't, he was impressed, I'm sure, but he still wanted to remain in his homeland. When they erected Fort Myers, in the process of erecting Fort Myers, he actually came to the fort and he told the officer there that he seeks nothing but peace. This land was given to him by the treaty of ending the Second Seminole War. And he wanted to keep the peace and keep the treaty. He wanted these lands here for his tribe. But that wasn't the plan of the federal government. A kind of a brief tangent. As he traveled up and back from Washington City, as you know, when you register, when you go into a hotel, you have to register. And they would have a register which all guests would have to sign. Billy, of course, couldn't sign. An officer would do it for him, and he would be identified as William B. Legs. Now, once the hostilities started becoming more intense, an Indian agent would bring several Seminole chiefs back from Oklahoma or back from the Arkansas Territory to try to convince Billy to move, to relocate out west. And I'm sure that if they were successful, they would have got a good kickback from the government. But Billy was still sitting on a fence either way, even though they promised him they would not be resettled in the same area as the Creeks because they were adversaries to one another. Billy still was undecided, but the federal government would sweeten the deal with a payout. And what happened was Billy himself would get $5,000 to surrender. Now, remember, this is 1850 value. He'd get $5,000 to surrender. He would get an additional $2,500 for the value of his cattle, which was left behind. Each warrior would get $1,000. Each child, woman, and elderly person, like myself, would get $100. And the total came to about $70,300 in change, and I don't know why the change was there. But Billy would accept the offer. He would bring all of the Seminoles that were going to go with him to the Western Territory to Fort Myers. They would camp out east of the fort along a creek, which since that time has been called Billy's Creek. And then on May 8th, 1858, he would bring his tribe into the fort. They would board a steamboat that would take them first to Edgemont Key to pick up 40 more Indians, and then they would head to New Orleans. And at New Orleans, they spend a couple days and then head upriver to the Arkansas Territory and then hoof westward. Billy would live probably 1 or 2 years after resettling, and then he would die of smallpox. Now, the Third Seminole War would end and the fort would be abandoned. But while the convincing and all this stuff going on with trying to convince Billy of resettling, there was another thing happening at the same time involving Fort Myers. And that is the federal government was astounded at the cost of this temporary fort. And they wanted to get at the bottom of it. So they would order Major Justice McKinstry, who was a quartermaster officer, to go to Fort Myers to find out why in the name of God it cost so much money to construct a temporary fort in the midst of the Florida wilderness. And he would examine all the structures. He would look at all the paperwork for the expenditures and so on and so forth. Well, when he arrived, he would receive a map drawn out for him of the fort. And this is the layout of the fort as you see it. This map was prepared by Captain Winfield Scott Hancock. And if anyone listening has a penchant to study the Civil War, Winfield Scott Hancock was a prominent United States Army general, played a major role in the Battle of Gettysburg each day, July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, played a major role in the Overland Campaign, and about halfway through the Petersburg Campaign, he would be forced to resign from active duty or combat duty as a result of a wound. And if you ever want to read about Fort Myers, his wife, Almira, wrote reminiscences of Winfield Scott Hancock. And one of the chapters there, she will talk about the fort at Fort Myers and how it was like living there. Well, this is the fort, and I'm going to go through each section so you can find out if you see any red flags that McKinstry may have found. Well, first off, we have the pier, about 1,000 feet long, and a wharf. And again, all the supplies were coming in via the ship. So they would be unloaded on the wharf, and there was a cart railway. The supplies would be loaded into the cart, and the cart would be pushed down to either one of 3 warehouses. And this process would repeat until all the supplies were put away. There could be no overland supplies brought that way because all there was Indian trails at the time. Next to the pier, farther up along the river, would be the officers' quarters with the commanding officer there. And as you notice, they're along the river. Rank has its privileges, as many in the service know. These officers' quarters would have plastered walls. Now, remember, we're in the 1850s in Florida. They have plastered walls. They have rough-cut, tongue and groove floors, cedar shingles, windows, and doors. They have 2 outhouses, and downriver from the outhouses, and why they put it downriver, I don't know, is the bathing pavilion. I would be very hesitant about taking an early morning dip when the effluent flow would be the greatest. But at any rate, that's the way it was set up. The parade grounds had a manicured lawn. I'm sure this was just the Florida type grass, not the floor tam, which predominates in certain areas in Florida today. And Francis Asbury Henry, who would later become known as the father of Lee County and one of the first groups of settlers that would come into the settlement of Fort Myers after the Civil War was done. During the Third Seminole War, he was a scout and a courier for the Army, and he came to Fort Myers several times, and he wrote about the conditions of the fort, which truly amazed him at the how it was kept up and how the soldiers were neatly dressed at all times. Well, he will say there will be a palm tree or two around, a manicured lawn, there'll be the flagpole. And again, south of that would be the barracks for the enlisted men. And back where my video screen is the kitchen that they would have. Now, there would be service or utility buildings as well. The sutler store would be comparable to a BX. This would be items that would not be supplied via the quartermaster or the commissary. Most importantly, whiskey and cigars. Now, again, it's 1850 Florida. There's no drive-in theaters here. There's got to be something for them to do. Elmira Hancock, in her reminiscence, will tell of how soldiers would sneak out of the fort, go get hammered, and then try to sneak back in. And she'll tell the tale of how one drunken soldier tried to sneak back in, made a little bit too much noise, and he was shot because he was thought to be an Indian sneaking in, and he died. And the individual that shot him was his best friend. And he had PTSD and had to be relocated up north. But at any rate, there's a carpenter store, blacksmith shop, a bakehouse, and that's sounding really good. I think I'd like to get transferred there. Laundry, and they would have a civilian gardener who had two very large gardens of vegetables and fruits to supply the soldiers with fresh veggies and fruits. Perhaps the biggest red flag of all was the hospital. And the hospital was 3 stories, a chimney at each end, lath and plastered walls that were painted, dressed up, tongue and groove floors, windows and doors, of course. It would have verandas around the first and the second floor. It would have its own separate kitchen and pier area. Now, the hospital itself cost $30,000 to construct, and that's in 1850 money, and in 2021 value, that would be about $1,055,000 and change. So you can probably see where Justice McKinstry is going to be coming up with his conclusions. And then we have the bowling alley. Okay, well, again, there's no drive-in theater here, so the troops have got to do something. And it was stated that this bowling alley was constructed by them on their off-duty hours using materials they got from the surrounding areas. Whether that's true or not, I really can't state. I don't think that McKinstry bought it for 1 minute. So McKinstry's conclusion, as you could imagine, he says, how far your authority to erect the most temporary structures has been exceeded, and necessary expenditures that were extremely lavish and uncalled for this fort. Now, the Third Seminole War is going to end, and what's going to happen to Fort Myers? Well, as far as this report goes, it seems to be buried somewhere. Nothing really happens to anybody involved in the construction of the fort or ordering the construction of the fort. You have to remember this was made up of yellow pine, which at the time was the premium wood to build. It was rot resistant, insect resistant, and they had a lot of amenities in this fort. but for some reason it was swept under the rug with the gaiety of the ending of the Third Seminole War, and perhaps also because of the upcoming dark clouds of the Civil War. As far as Justice McKinstry himself, he's kind of very colorful character. One book would claim chiefly celebrated for having been one of the most thoroughgoing rogues ever to wear a United States uniform. That's not a very good job recommendation. In November of 1861, just at the start of the Civil War, he would be arrested for graft, corruption, and fraud. At this time, he was the quartermaster in charge of the Department of the West in St. Louis. And I was able to dig up 2 deals that he brokered between a supplier and the United States Army. And in one of them, after the deal was finalized, his wife would receive a $3,000 silver service set as a token of appreciation. And on another deal, the company would receive a 35% profit on the contract, which is a pretty fair amount. He would be jailed up until January of 1863, when he would be cashiered out of the service, and then he would bounce back, as you could expect, and he would be a speculator and a stockbroker on the New York Stock Exchange. Well, Fort Myers during the Civil War. In late 1863, orders are going to come down to reestablish the fort at Fort Myers and have it manned by United States Army troops. In February of 1864, Captain Griffey is going to take the 47th Pennsylvania down to the Caloosahatchee to find out what's left of Fort Myers after several years it's been vacant, and to renovate what they have to and construct the fort there. And they're going to find that a good portion of the buildings remain, but the stockade is gone. And what they decide to do is to construct 4 blockhouses. It's what they call a solid point defense. And each blockhouse would be located, and each one would be surrounded by, on 2 or 3 sides, by entrenchments. These entrenchments would be a moat, which would break up a frontal attack by an enemy force, and then a burn right behind it from which the Union soldiers could fire from. This blockhouse was not quite completed at the time of the Battle of Fort Myers. Surrounding the entire area would be a wood fence. Now, this is not a barrier by any means, but just a demarcation. This is a diagram which was drawn by a soldier in 1864 showing Fort Myers. And again, the river is out here with the pier, and you notice the buildings along the river front. These were probably just had to be renovated. But note, 2 of the blockhouses are shown here, and you get a good idea of how the entrenchments were made. Here is the moat, or the ditch, I should call it, which would break up a frontal attack. And the burn was behind which the Union soldiers could be situated to fire on the attackers. And there would be the wood fence out here, and you can see a portion of it down there. Now, in July of 1863, the United States Army would capture the citadel city of Vicksburg, Mississippi, which was the major point in obtaining control of the Mississippi River. Right after that, Port Hudson would fall as well. And then from Cairo, Illinois, all the way down to Fort New Orleans, the United States Army and the freshwater fleet would have control of the Mississippi. This would split the Confederacy into two sections. But most importantly about this is that Texas at this time was the major supplier of beef for the Confederate Army. And the Union control of the Mississippi would shut down major cattle drives across the Mississippi and thus deprive the Confederacy of beef. Now, there would be a trickle of cattle getting through, but just a small fraction of what was available from Texas. Well, what this meant was that Florida now was going to be the main cattle supplier for the Confederacy. Ever since the time of the Spanish, cattle have been grazed in Florida, and they're still being grazed today. When the Spanish taught the Indians about grazing cattle, it was free-ranged, as it was in Spain. By that, they meant that the animals would actually roam free. They were not fenced in into an area where they would graze. They would munch up in one area and then continue on munching along in another area and so forth. And you would know your cattle by the brand and a lot of times by where they were located. Well, the Confederate commissary officer in Florida would have quotas, and he is in the process of trying to have as much beef shipped up to southern Georgia, the railhead there in Baldwin, to ship out to the Army of Tennessee, the garrison at South Carolina, and perhaps even some reaching the Army of Northern Virginia under Robert Lee. But at any rate, the amount of cattle he is able to ship is not doesn't meet quota. And the one thing about driving cattle in Florida is it's seasonal. The other thing is it takes expert individuals to drive cattle. So the cattlemen, the cowboys, and white settlers who have cattle and know how to handle them will be exempted from military service, and they are going to establish rounding up the cattle and driving the cattle northward. The United States Army troops at Fort Myers are going to try to steal cattle, and they're going to, if they come across a cattle drive, they're going to try to scatter the cattle and attack the cowboys and cattlemen that are driving the cattle. This is going to go on for a while. And before I get on to that topic, let me show you a blockhouse. This is a diagram by Mark Appleby, and I'll refer to this at the end of the lecture. This is the blockhouse at Fort Myers. At the time of the Battle of Fort Myers, there were two companies of the 2nd United States Colored Troops, companies D and I, two companies of the 110th New York Volunteers, and one company of the 2nd United States Florida Cavalry. And this cavalry unit was made up of civilians, primarily Union sympathizers, Confederate deserters, and mostly people sitting on the fence. Their loyalty would go one way or another, depending on who was winning. But most importantly to our story is they would be having their civilian families with them, and they would be protected at Fort Myers as well. And again, these blockhouses were self-sustaining units. Each would have a well. They would have food supplies, ammunition, spare weapons, sleeping quarters. One would have a jail. So they kind of like, well, if you had to go in there, it would be cramped and everything, but you could survive if you could fight the enemy off. Well, the United States forces are doing an admirable job in disrupting cattle, more than the Confederates would like to see. The commissary officer in Florida is going to request Confederate troops to protect the cattle. The Confederacy cannot afford to give up any regular Army troops. So what happens is these cattlemen, cowboys, and so forth are formed into a militia called the Cattle Guard Battalion, nicknamed the Cow Cavalry. And there'll be 9 companies of this militia throughout Florida. That is through the Panhandle all the way over to St. Augustine, and then down through Paynes Prairie near Gainesville, a prime grazing area, and just south of Fort Meade. And as the Union activity increases, Colonel Charles Munnerlyn, who is the commander of the Cow Cavalry, if you want to call it that, will order Major Footman to take 2.5 companies of men down to Fort Myers to capture the fort or to drive the Union troops away. And he will receive the order in February. He will leave with his 2.5 company, probably about 270 to 295 men, will leave Fort Meade. And on the night of February 19th, they're going to be crossing the Caloosahatchee in the area of where Fort Thompson was. It's going to be raining hard. They have a boat which they're able to transfer the men as well as supplies back and forth. But when they're going across with a good portion of their artillery ordnance, they have 1 cannon, by the way. When they're going across with a portion of their artillery ordnance, the boat will capsize and they'll lose that. So they're not going to have the full complement of artillery, powder, and shell that they started out with. They're going to go down the Fort Thompson Road, which will lead directly to Fort Myers. It's tough going through the nighttime. The next morning, February 20th, they're going to capture Union pickets at just east of Billy's Creek. And then they're going to head closer to the fort. There will be a laundry detail of 5 black soldiers doing laundry. They will be captured. The sergeant commanding that detail will try to escape to alert the fort. He will be shot and killed. The report of the rifle, however, is not heard at the fort. So Footman and, most importantly, his subordinates are telling Footman to attack the fort right away. A surprise attack would have them the best advantage that they could have, and they would be able to rout the Yankees. Well, Footman refuses to do this, and the reason is because of the civilian families that are living associated with Fort Myers. He wants to give them a chance to sequester out of the line of fire. So he will send a courier under a flag of truce with a demand to surrender the fort. Captain Doyle will receive this demand, and he will give some expletive reply that I'll translate into "go pound sand." Major Footman gets the reply. He then disperses his troops and cannon, and they begin firing on Fort Myers. Fort Myers will have 3 cannon. Again, Footman has only 1 with very little ammunition left. And then there'll be skirmishing behind trees, primarily rifle fire between the Cow Cavalry and the regular U.S. Army troops. Well, this will go on until the late afternoon, and then Footman will call off the attack. They're running low on ammunition, and so he will back his troops off well past Billy's Creek, and then they'll camp there for the night. They have captured some cattle and some horses, but that's really about it. And then the next morning, they will return on the return trip to Fort Meade. Now, in the Battle of Fort Myers, which I would call nothing more than a major skirmish, there would be 4 Union soldiers killed and a score wounded. As far as Confederate casualties, they would never release the number. However, Captain Doyle, when he reconnoitered the area where the Confederates were fighting from, found evidence of multiple casualties from bloodied bandages and litters that were made up and so forth. So the battle is over. And if you talk to some people in Fort Myers will state that it was the southernmost battle in the Civil War. And this was a broadcast for quite a while. Many people believed it. And again, it's going to depend on when you define the ending of the Civil War. If the Civil War ends on April 9th with the surrender of Robert Lee to U.S. Grant at Appomattox, well, then they would be correct. But it didn't. It would go on until actually June, when all the hostilities would finally end. Fort Myers is located at 26.6 degrees north latitude, and a place called Palmetto Ranch is located at 25.9 degrees north latitude. And the Battle of Palmetto Ranch occurred on May 12th and 13th, and that is going to win the contest for the southernmost battle of the Civil War. But don't say that in Fort Myers, please. The fort would be abandoned in June of 1865, and all the troops would then leave the area. The buildings of the fort are going to be ransacked by people from as far away as Cedar Key, which is way upriver. I shouldn't say upriver, way up the Gulf Coast. They lack building materials. There's plenty of building materials at the fort, and they're going to come down. They're ripping out doors, windows. It's like a regular Home Depot there. In 1866, two men, Manuel Gonzalez and Joseph Vivas, will start a settlement at the site of the old fort. Now, Manuel Gonzalez knows the site of Fort Myers very well because he has been delivering supplies there, and he knows that it's a great place for a fort. So he chooses this place. Joseph Vivas will come with his bride. They'll be the first couple to honeymoon in Fort Myers. They will start the settlement that will ultimately grow into the town of Fort Myers in 1885, and then into the city in 1911. And lastly, there was a special postmark issued on June 29th, 1995, at the Pagefield Post Office, which shows the blockhouse, which I showed you in a previous slide. And then it would have the 130th anniversary of the Battle of Fort Myers Station. And again, this was a one-time offer on that date. And that is the presentation I have for you. I hope you found it informative and interesting. And if there's any questions or comments, I'll try to answer the questions for you.
That was very, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, sir.
Okay. That was very interesting. I do appreciate all the details and everything. A couple of things. During the Civil War, it was mainly occupied by Confederate cattlemen, obviously, and they were actually not supplying the Confederacy. They were shipping them through Punta Rassa to Cuba because they got paid in gold rather than in Confederate.
That is exactly right.
And
initially, at the start of the Civil War, they would be shipping it to the Confederacy. But Jacob Summerlin would use James McKay, who had a blockade runner out of Tampa. And they would come down in the night to Punta Rassa, pick up the cattle, because Summerlin had a whole complex down there at Punta Rassa, and they'd load up the ship and ship it down. The Confederacy was giving them $8 a head in paper money, which by 1863 and 1864 was almost worthless, whereas the Cubans were giving them, I think it was
$35.
$30 to $35
in
but
gold.
it would vary, yes, in gold doubloons. And that's true, sir.
Yeah, I have one other interesting thing during the Civil War. I had a letter addressed to a judge in Fort Myers in 1862 from New Orleans. So there must have been a town there if they had a judge living there. So there must have been something in 1862 in Fort Myers. And I don't know if you know the judge. His name was James Evans. And I don't know if you know anything about that.
Yes. I don't know. See, James Evans, after the end of the Third Seminole War in 1858, Evans was part of a surveying crew that had come down, and they were just starting to survey along the Caloosahatchee, along the South Bank. And then the Civil War, well, actually, because of the impending Civil War, or the clouds of doom that were gathering, the surveying crew was called off. Evans, who was a Virginian, would stay down there in the Fort Myers area, what would become Fort Myers.
Yeah, yeah.
He would then bring his slaves down, and they would start planting tropical trees, oranges, citrus, other citrus, melons, and so forth. He was trying rice, coffee, and sugarcane as well. And then when the war broke out, he went back up to Virginia and served in the army. After the war, he had come down and he received a homestead plot that would include all of Fort Myers at the time. Now, as to 1862, I really don't know. I wouldn't think that he would be there in the state of a town or a settlement, because from what I have heard, when the hostilities broke out, he returned and he became a major in the Confederate Army.
Oh, I don't know. This would have been it was actually in July of 1862. But he was also called Esquire. So I don't know if he was a judge or whether he was just a very important person. But
I couldn't tell you that either. I know he was a very important person.
Yeah.
But I can't address. I don't believe there was a settlement there in 1862.
Could you also? I just wrote an article on Fort Miaka on the opposite bank, or just north of where Caloosahatchee, and Twiggs had set up to try to put forts completely across the entire state of Florida to separate the Seminoles from their Everglades, and Fort Harney was established as the main transport, and it sounds like it was more important than Fort Myers, and I just wonder if that's true or not.
At a time, George Meade from Gettysburg fame would lay out.
Well, he was a surveyor.
Exactly, at that time, and he would lay out a series of forts and a route for resupply prior to the Civil War. Now, I don't know if he was involved in locating the forts or not.
He and Twiggs both, Meade and Twiggs both set up the location of the forts.
Okay.
And eventually had the trading post up at Fort, which is now Fort Meade.
Right.
Is a different fort where they traded with the Indians. But I just wondered if you've done research on Fort Harney.
No, I have not.
Harney at all?
No.
No. Okay.
Harney.
It sounded like it was going to go ahead.
Go on, sir.
It sounded, at least what I was reading, that was a more important fort in the Third Seminole War than was Fort Meade, and that was my only question.
Instead of Fort Myers, you mean?
Yeah, Fort Myers. Yeah.
Well, Fort Myers, what was it was established primarily as a location where Seminole Indians could voluntarily, if they would, come and surrender. And secondly, it would just be a jumping off point for patrols to head east into the Big Cypress to start surveying. And if they ran across any warring Seminole tribes, to fight them and so forth. But what the United States government was doing, and Billy Bowlegs was aware of this, because in the Second Seminole War, when the surveyors came, right behind them were the white settlers. So Billy Bowlegs knew when they started surveying that they were going to break the treaty, and they had already broken it. So that is why there became the hostilities that did. But Fort Myers, I do not believe, was as important as the forts more in the central part of Florida.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dean.
I have three items to briefly talk about. So an esquire there were esquires and barristers in the mid 1800s, especially England, Canada, and I think the United States, where an esquire, they were both lawyers. An esquire did legal work in his office, and a barrister would go to court, to the bar, and actually argue for cases.
Okay.
The second thing is
Thank you.
that Manuel Gonzalez, you mentioned, set up the first town outside the fort right after the Civil War. He was also ran, I believe, in the 1850s, the ship that delivered supplies and mail through the Gulf from Tampa to Fort Myers. There was no road that went to Fort Myers. It was all by water. So the cover that was really inspired this article traveled from Fort Myers, probably handled by Manuel Gonzalez to Tampa. Then it went by land, Tampa up to Flat area, and then it went by sea all the way up to Norfolk, and then by land again to Jerusalem, Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
The last thing is the date February 20th is very interesting because in 1850 it's when they broke ground, and in 1865 it's the day of the Confederate battle. So it was exactly 15 years. And the cover that I got from Dean, wrote the article about, is dated August 20th. So that was only the letter was 6 months after the day they raised the flag at Fort Myers.
Uh-huh. Yes, an interesting thing about Manuel Gonzalez, he came over from Spain when he was 14, and he was shipwrecked with a lot of other young men on this boat, and he would end up working on a boat and then becoming a pilot, and then actually becoming a captain of his own ship. And he would, as you stated, bring mail up to the Fort Myers. He would also bring the whiskey and cigars as well as other supplies. And it was stated that during the Civil War, the men could recognize his sails from a distance, and they would actually start to line up on the pier waiting for the stuff to be unloaded if they were off duty. So he was well known to the soldiers, and he knew a lot about Fort Myers, and that was why he wanted to settle there after the Civil War. Thank you.
Jack.
Yes.
Steve Patrick here. I've got just a comment and a question. I love your presentation, and it may surprise some of you. My great-grandfather, John Nelson Patrick, was a member of the 2nd Florida Cavalry.
Wow.
At Fort Myers. And I've seen his muster-in records. It's on microfilm in the Orlando Library.
Uh-huh.
And just comment on this. Didn't the Yankees make a retaliatory raid up the Peace River, burning some homes after that battle in Fort Myers? And didn't some of these troops participate in the raid towards Tallahassee towards the end of the war?
I don't believe they did, and the reason why is one of the beliefs was that even prior to the Battle of Fort Myers, they were thinking of deactivating Fort Myers, and the evidence that they have for that is kind of scant. But for the two companies of United States colored troops only had 35 musket or 35 rifles, I should say, for the two companies. And there were other supplies that were not present at the fort at the time of the battle. So there's the belief that they may have been in the process of abandoning the fort anyways, but they still were able to counteract the Confederate attack. And that's very interesting about your relative. Would you happen to know if he was a Union sympathizer, or what drove him to become a member of the 2nd U.S. Florida?
The Patrick family settled in Orlando area in 1843. And as I understand it, about 1861-62, my great-great-grandfather, John, and his son and family moved south and to the South Florida area, possibly to get away from the war.
Mhm.
And John and his brother Joe joined the Union forces. And I always heard that the Yankees came in and said, all right, all you surrounding people here, you're running cattle, you're bad. Either join us or we're going to lock you up and let you not do any of your activities.
Yeah.
But he and his brother surely did join. Two of the brothers in Orlando fought for the South and went up to Georgia. But he lived till 1918, 17, I think, got a pension, carried on with my great grandmother until she died about 1933, and kept my father and the family in the Depression in food, thanks to the U.S. Army and his service there in Fort Myers.
Wonderful.
It
Wonderful.
is neat.
That's good. We have rosters of a lot of the soldiers there, but it's incomplete. But I'll have to take a look to try to find his name in it, if it is there.
Yeah. Furthermore, I believe in 1870 census, my great-great-grandfather was enrolled at Fort Thompson as a place there, and my recollection is that he may have been enrolled both by a census taker coming up from Monroe County and counted there, and another census taker that came down north trying to find everybody and count them. He might have been counted twice in the census in 1870. I don't know how many others in the family. I don't recollect all that, but they continue there in South Florida.
Yeah. Monroe County came up all the way to Fort Myers was part of Monroe County when it was a town. And it was very shortly after that, there was a disagreement with Fort Myers and the Monroe County commissioners. And then Lee County was formed very shortly thereafter. But they were part of Monroe County. And that would include even current day Glades and
Hendry.
Hendry Glades and Collier were all part of initially Lee County when it was formed in 1887.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Steve, do you know
Yeah.
where your ancestor is buried?
John Nelson Patrick. I tried to find it. He last settled. It's interesting that after the war in the 1880s, he moved back to Orlando, Pine Castle area for a while. And for a number of years, my grandfather was born in Pine Castle. And so any animosity between the brothers probably didn't exist because he was successful there. In 1885, he was listed as a letter carrier in Pine Castle. But eventually he went back to Nocatee, south of Arcadia, and he died there in the Cambridge Burying Grounds. And I went to look for I couldn't find anything on it, but it was around south of Arcadia there.
One good resource for that too. I don't know if you other folks have used it. Find a Grave. Actually, pretty good resource for
Yes.
people. So, might be worth a shot. So, any other questions or comments for Jack? Well, Jack, thanks very much for
Thank you
joining
very
us
much.
tonight. I would like to make two real quick announcements, and these are kind of sort of personal. I don't know, but I'm going to be the volunteer chairman for Boston 2026. So anybody considering working in Boston for that, International World Expo, we'd love to have you on board to do that. So that's one quick plug. The other is I have a site on Bubble Up. It's BUBLUP.com, bubbleup.com. Tom Lear has used it. Some others have used it. Vern, I think, has. I have a ton of resources on there, postal history and just history, and even more. I have over 100 gigabytes of stuff on there. So there is a tremendous amount of stuff on there. I did put my email address in the chat. If you're interested in having me add you to that site, it's free. It's easy to navigate. You can search very easily. Things are in folders and you can download things there. And it's pretty neat. I have it divided up the best I can, with different states or topics as, I'm trying to do the best I can with keeping it organized, but it is very searchable. So that's really cool. If you're looking for something, I have a lot of documents from Google Books and all kind of different resources. So please just let me know if you'd like to be a part of that. I think it's worth exploring on there. Okay. Well, thanks very much. I appreciate everybody being here. I believe that the board from the Florida Postal History Society is going to stay on just a little bit after here. And so to depart. And thank you, Kathy, for coming. We really appreciate it. And please stay in touch.
Thanks very much.
All right. Thank you, Jack.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jack. We appreciate it.